Pelican Bay Supermax exposed, true crime behind prison walls. Blood on the concrete. The camera zooms into the cold gray walls of Pelican Bay State Prison. The scene is the prison yard, silent, tense, and filled with men who look like they've already lost everything. Suddenly, screams cut through the air. A group of tattooed inmates charge forward. Shanks, homemade knives sharpened from metal scraps, flash in the sunlight. A man is cornered, trapped against the wall. He raises his arms, but the attack comes fast and brutal. Within seconds, blood spills across the concrete. Guards scramble, alarms blare, rifles point from the gun towers, and chaos explodes inside the most secure prison in California. This is Pelican Bay Supermax, a place designed to keep the worst of the worst under control. But tonight, the walls themselves seem powerless against the violence burning inside. And this was just the beginning. What led to this deadly outbreak? And how deep do the secrets of Pelican Bay really go? The walls of fear. Pelican Bay wasn't built like a normal prison. In 1989, California opened this facility in Crescent City, near the Oregon border, far from major cities. The idea was simple: isolate the most dangerous inmates in a place so remote that escape was nearly impossible. The prison was split into two worlds. The general population, where inmates lived in cell blocks, had limited yard time and tried to survive gang politics. The Security Housing Unit, or SHU, a place so harsh inmates called it the dungeon. Here, prisoners spent 22 to 23 hours a day locked alone in windowless cells the size of a bathroom. The SHU was meant to break the influence of prison gangs like the Aryan Brotherhood, the Mexican Mafia, and the Black Guerrilla Family. These groups had controlled much of California's prison system for decades, ordering hits, moving drugs, and running extortion rings. Life inside Pelican Bay was fear on repeat. Every move, eating, sleeping, walking into the yard, could mean facing an enemy. Guards walked with riot gear, and even they weren't safe. Inmates sharpened toothbrushes into weapons. A single wrong look could spark a war. But under all this pressure, something was building. Inmates weren't just surviving, they were planning. And one night, in the prison showers, the first strike came. First blood in the showers. It started quiet. The echo of dripping water, the sound of bare feet slapping against wet tiles. For a few moments, the shower block felt almost calm. But calm never lasted long inside Pelican Bay. A young inmate stepped inside, his head down, minding his own business. Without warning, two figures rushed from the steam. The first strike was fast, a blade tearing across his chest. He stumbled, gasping, as another slash carved deep into his shoulder. Blood splashed across the tiles. The young man collapsed, slipping on the wet floor while the attackers kept stabbing. By the time guards stormed in, weapons drawn, the attackers had melted back into the crowd of inmates. Nobody spoke. Nobody pointed fingers. Silence was the law of survival. For the prison, this was a message. The gangs were still in control no matter how many walls, fences, or towers Pelican Bay built. But the real nightmare came later, when the violence moved beyond the showers, into the open yards, where hundreds of men could turn a fight into a massacre. The yard erupts. The prison yard at Pelican Bay was supposed to be a release. A chance for inmates to stretch, breathe fresh air, or do push-ups in the cold sun. But on this day, the yard turned into a battlefield. Two rival groups faced each other. Words were exchanged, quiet at first, then louder, sharper. A push, a spit, and suddenly fists flew. Within seconds, dozens of men were brawling, their tattooed bodies colliding like wild animals. Shouts filled the air, echoing off the high concrete walls. Guards screamed orders, but nobody listened. Then came the weapons. Shanks appeared from hidden pockets, duct taped to thighs, shoved into shoes. The fight escalated into a bloodbath. From the gun towers, guards aimed rifles. Rubber bullets first, then live rounds if things spiraled too far. Warning shots cracked through the air. The crowd scattered, men dropping flat on the concrete, hands behind their heads. Blood pooled under several bodies. The sirens echoed long after the fight was over. But in Pelican Bay, a fight never really ends. It only pauses. And soon, another battle was brewing, this time not between gangs but between inmates and the prison itself. The hunger strike. Locked inside the SHU, many inmates felt like they were being buried alive. No sunlight. No human contact. No end in sight. Some had been kept there for years without ever committing new crimes inside prison walls, just for their gang associations. By 2011, desperation turned into resistance. Inmates launched a hunger strike, refusing meals to protest indefinite solitary confinement. At first, prison officials ignored it. They'd seen inmates starve themselves before. But this was different. It spread. Dozens joined, then hundreds. At the peak, more than 30,000 prisoners across California refused food, inspired by the men of Pelican Bay. The strike made headlines, forcing the public to look at conditions most people had never even imagined. Guards watched as trays of untouched food stacked up. Inmates grew weak, collapsing in their cells. The prison medical staff struggled to keep up. Pelican Bay was no longer just a prison story, it had become a human rights crisis. And just when it seemed things might calm down, the violence returned, with a vengeance. Fire in the block. It began with smoke. At first, just a faint haze drifting through the cell block. Then the smell of burning cloth and plastic filled the air. An inmate had set fire to his mattress in protest. The flames spread fast, blackening the ceiling. Guards rushed in with extinguishers, coughing as smoke poured down the hall. Inmates screamed, some kicking their cell doors, others laughing at the chaos. The sprinklers finally erupted, drenching the entire block in dirty water. But amid the confusion, another attack broke out. In the chaos of the fire, a hidden shank was pulled, and one inmate lunged at another through the bars. Blood sprayed across the wet floor. Guards tackled the attacker, dragging him out as alarms wailed. The fire was put out. The block was secured. But Pelican Bay had once again proved one thing. Inside these walls, chaos could strike at any moment. And what came next would be even deadlier. The silent killer. After the fire, Pelican Bay returned to its eerie rhythm. The clang of steel doors, the echo of boots in the hallway, the shuffle of shackled feet. But tension lingered. Everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the next eruption. Then the silence broke in the most chilling way. A guard making his rounds found an inmate lying motionless on his bunk. No signs of a struggle, no weapon in sight, just stillness. At first, staff thought it might be exhaustion or a hunger strike casualty. But when medical rushed in, the truth became clear. The man had been murdered quietly in the night. Investigators pieced together what happened. The inmate had been strangled with a braided piece of fabric, possibly ripped from sheets or clothing. No one heard a scream. No one saw the killer. In Pelican Bay, silence itself had become a weapon. Rumors spread fast, a gang hit carried out with surgical precision. If the gangs could kill without a sound, what chance did anyone else have? But the prison wasn't just fighting gangs, it was fighting its own reputation. And soon the outside world came knocking. The Watchers. Word of Pelican Bay's brutality had reached beyond prison walls. Journalists, lawyers, and human rights activists demanded access. They wanted to see for themselves what California's most feared prison had become. When the cameras rolled inside, the public saw a world few had imagined. Men locked in bare concrete cells for decades, hands sliding notes under doors just for human contact, inmates pacing in circles like caged animals. Some guards spoke too, admitting the stress of working in a place where violence could explode at any second. "Every day you walk in here," one officer said, "you're rolling dice with your life." For a brief moment, light pierced the darkness. Courts debated whether long-term solitary confinement was constitutional. Protesters outside the prison gates demanded change. But inside, change was dangerous. Inmates who spoke too freely risked retaliation. Whispers spread of names being marked for death. And one day that threat became real, in the yard. The yard ambush. The yard was crowded. Inmates walked in circles, others lifted weights, and some huddled in small groups, whispering under their breath. The tension felt heavier than usual, like everyone was holding their breath. Then it happened. From the far end of the yard, a group of men surged forward. Their target, a lone inmate who had been accused of snitching to outsiders. Shanks flashed, slicing the air. The man tried to run, but he was tackled hard to the ground. Screams echoed as the attacker struck again and again. Guards unleashed tear gas, the acrid smoke filling the yard. But even choking and blinded, the attackers didn't stop. Blood poured across the dirt as the victim's cries grew weaker. By the time order was restored, the man lay lifeless. The message was loud and clear. Silence wasn't just survival, it was law. Anyone who broke it paid in blood. But what came next wasn't just violence. It was something darker, stranger, and harder to explain. Shadows and solitary. The SHU was built to crush the human spirit. No clocks. No windows. Just endless gray walls. Inmates said days blurred together until you forgot whether it was morning or night. But some inmates swore there was something else inside those walls, something beyond human. They whispered about shadows that moved across the cells at night, about cold drafts that felt like unseen hands brushing against their skin. One man claimed he heard voices whispering his name through the vents. Another scratched strange symbols into the concrete, saying they were protection against whatever lives in the dark. Guards laughed it off as paranoia, the natural effect of sensory deprivation. But when one officer swore he saw a figure standing in an empty cell, staring back at him, even the laughter stopped. Whether real or imagined, the terror of solitary pushed some inmates past their breaking point. And one of them would soon do something so shocking, it would shake Pelican Bay to its core. The escape attempt. It started with a plan whispered in the darkness. A group of inmates in the SHU believed they could dig their way out. Using pieces of metal smuggled from workshops, they chipped at the concrete floor night after night, covering the hole with a mattress during inspections. Weeks turned into months. Finally, the tunnel was ready, or so they thought. On a stormy night, the inmates made their move. They squeezed through the jagged opening, dragging themselves into the narrow tunnel. Mud clung to their bodies, their breaths echoing in the suffocating dark. But just before they reached the outer fence, alarms erupted. Floodlights snapped on, slicing through the rain. Guards surrounded the yard with rifles. The escape was over before it even began. The inmates were dragged back inside, beaten, bloodied, and thrown into deeper isolation. Yet for a moment, their attempt proved something shocking. Even in one of the most secure prisons in America, the human will to be free would never die. But what happened next would make escape attempts look small compared to the storm of violence waiting to erupt again. The price of loyalty. Inside Pelican Bay, gangs ruled not just through fear but through loyalty. New inmates were often given a choice: join a group for protection or stand alone and risk being prey. One young inmate, barely 20, was pressured to join a powerful gang. He resisted, hoping to keep his head down and finish his sentence quietly. But in Pelican Bay, neutrality was a death sentence. First came the warnings, threats whispered through cell doors, food trays slid across the floor with messages scratched into them. Then came the beating. The young man was ambushed in the showers, fists and boots slamming into his ribs until he collapsed. When guards found him, he was barely breathing. The message was clear. In Pelican Bay, loyalty wasn't optional, it was survival. But loyalty also had a price. Because the deeper you were pulled into a gang, the harder it was to get out. And one man's attempt to break free would lead to blood. Blood oath. Deep inside one of the cell blocks, a small group of tattooed inmates gathered in the shadows. A torn piece of cloth lay across the floor. One by one, each man pulled a razor across his palm, pressing his bloody hand to the cloth in a vow of brotherhood. It was a ritual older than the prison itself, a blood oath to prove loyalty to the gang. For them, betrayal meant death and silence was sacred. But one of these men secretly wanted out. He had grown tired of years in the SHU, tired of orders that left blood on his hands. He dreamed of transfer, parole, a second chance. What he didn't know was that someone had already whispered his doubts to the wrong ears. Days later, his body was found in the yard, slashed and stabbed. The blood oath wasn't just ceremony, it was law. And breaking that law had cost him his life. But that killing didn't just silence him, it ignited something bigger, something that would set the entire prison on edge. The lockdown. After the blood oath killing, Pelican Bay erupted in paranoia. Guards feared a full-scale riot. Inmates whispered of revenge. The air felt heavy, as if violence waited around every corner. Then came the order: total lockdown. Cells slammed shut. Movement stopped. Inmates were trapped in their concrete boxes for days, then weeks. Meals came through slots in steel doors. Yard time was cancelled. But lockdown only fueled the rage. Inmates pounded on doors, screamed through vents, and flooded their cells with water. Some smeared walls with food, others banged metal bowls until the sound echoed like drums of war. For guards, the stress was crushing. Sleep-deprived and outnumbered, they patrolled halls filled with screams and threats. Then one night, during the lockdown, a guard was ambushed. Pulled into a cell trap, he was stabbed with a sharpened piece of plastic. His vest saved his life, but barely. The attack proved lockdown hadn't broken the inmates' will. If anything, it made them more dangerous. And soon, the lockdown would give way to something even worse. The riot. It started in the chow hall. Guards were escorting small groups of inmates to eat under strict supervision. Tension was high, eyes darting across tables. Then in a flash, a tray was flipped, food splattering across the floor. That was the signal. Dozens of inmates rose at once, fists swinging, shanks slashing. Chairs flew, metal clanged, bodies crashed into the walls. Guards rushed in, batons cracking against skulls, but the violence spread like wildfire. One inmate leapt onto a table, screaming a gang slogan before lunging into the fight below. Another smashed a tray against a guard's helmet, shattering plastic into sharp edges. Blood splattered across the walls, mixing with spilled soup and rice. The chow hall became a war zone. Pepper spray burned the air, tear gas stung eyes, and the chaos grew so loud it drowned out the alarms. By the time backup arrived, several men were dead and dozens more lay wounded. The riot left scars that would never fade. But it also set the stage for something even darker, revenge that reached beyond the prison walls. The hit list. After the riot, prison investigators scrambled to identify leaders and order new transfers. But inside, the gangs were already one step ahead. They had drawn up something far deadlier, a hit list. Names were whispered from cell to cell, scratched into hidden notes, passed along in food trays. The list didn't just include rival inmates, it included guards. One officer found his own name carved into the wall of a cell he was inspecting. Another received a letter at his home address, warning that his family wasn't safe. Panic spread among the staff. Some requested transfers. Others quit outright. For inmates, the hit list was a show of power. Even locked behind steel and concrete, they could reach out and strike fear into anyone. And then one night the threat became reality. A guard walking his tier was suddenly slashed across the face with a hidden blade. He stumbled back, blood streaming down his cheek, as inmates roared with laughter from their cells. The message was undeniable. Pelican Bay wasn't just a prison, it was a battlefield. And the war was far from over. Broken minds. Pelican Bay didn't just break bodies, it broke minds. After years in solitary, many inmates began showing signs of severe mental illness. Some paced in endless circles, muttering to themselves. Others smeared their walls with words written in their own blood. One inmate refused to speak for months, staring silently at the ceiling. Another screamed all night, pounding on his door until his fists bled. Guards learned to tune it out, but the sound gnawed at them too. Psychologists who visited called it SHU syndrome, a collapse of the human mind after too long without sunlight, touch, or freedom. But one man's breakdown didn't just end with whispers or screams. It ended in blood. During a routine check, he lunged at a guard with a sharpened piece of metal he'd hidden in his mattress. The guard barely survived, and the inmate was dragged away, his laughter echoing down the block. In Pelican Bay, madness and violence were never far apart. And that madness soon spread to the only place left where inmates still had control, the underground economy. The black market. Even in the tightest security, Pelican Bay had a secret: contraband. Drugs, cell phones, tobacco, everything had a price. Smuggling routes thrived. Some guards were bribed, some intimidated, and others simply turned a blind eye. Packages were thrown over fences, or hidden in legal mail. Once inside, the goods flowed through the prison like currency. A single cigarette could buy a meal. A smuggled cell phone could control drug deals outside prison walls. Power wasn't just about violence, it was about who controlled the black market. But with power came betrayal. One inmate accused of stealing from a gang stash was cornered in the laundry room. He begged for his life, offering to pay back what he'd taken. The answer came in steel, a blade driven into his stomach, left twisting as he crumpled on the floor. The black market kept Pelican Bay running in the shadows, but it also kept the violence alive. And soon that violence would explode again, bigger than ever. The Great Yard Riot. It began with a whisper, "Today's the day." In the main yard, two rival gangs had been circling each other for weeks. Old debts, fresh insults, and years of hatred finally boiled over. At first it was small, two men exchanging blows near the pull-up bars. But within seconds dozens joined in. The yard turned into a battlefield of fists, boots, and blades. Inmates sprinted across the dirt, leaping into the chaos. Guards fired warning shots, but the riot didn't stop. From the towers, rifles cracked, sending men diving for cover. Still the fight raged on. By the time smoke grenades filled the yard and riot squads stormed in, the ground was littered with bodies. Several men were dead. Dozens were wounded. The bloodied yard looked like a war zone. For Pelican Bay, this was one of the worst riots in its history. But for the inmates, it was just another chapter in their endless war. And from the ashes of that riot came a new wave of terror, one that even prison staff couldn't control. The revenge cycle. In Pelican Bay, violence never ended, it only shifted hands. Every stabbing, every riot, every killing sparked another round of revenge. After the Great Yard Riot, hit orders spread like wildfire. Some inmates sharpened weapons, waiting for their chance. Others struck fast, ambushing rivals in hallways or showers. The cycle spun endlessly, attack, retaliation, and then more blood. Guards tried to separate gangs, But the violence always found a way. Even transfers to other prisons didn't help. The gangs had networks everywhere. One night, an inmate was dragged into a cell by his so-called allies. They told him it was his turn to prove loyalty, to carry out a hit. When he refused, they left him beaten and bleeding on the floor, carving a message into his skin: "No one walks away." The revenge cycle had become a machine, feeding itself on endless fear and death. And soon, that machine would push the prison into its darkest moment yet. The final showdown. The tension inside Pelican Bay reached a breaking point. Guards were exhausted, inmates were restless, and the air buzzed with whispers of another riot. Everyone knew something big was coming, but no one knew when. It happened in the middle of the yard. A single argument turned violent, knives flashing in the sunlight. Within moments, the fight spread. Dozens of men charged into the chaos, screaming war cries, fists flying. This time the guards responded with everything they had. Tear gas filled the yard. Rubber bullets cracked across the concrete. Riot teams stormed in, shields clashing against bodies. From the towers, rifles fired live rounds. The clash lasted minutes, but it felt like hours. When the smoke cleared, the yard was littered with broken bodies. Some inmates were dead. Others were dragged away, blood streaming down their faces. Pelican Bay had survived another war, but at a cost. The prison was scarred, its reputation darker than ever. And the truth behind its walls was exposed for all to see. This wasn't just a prison. It was a battlefield where survival meant blood, silence, and fear. But the story of Pelican Bay didn't end here. Because inside those walls, behind every locked door, another secret waited to be uncovered. The whistleblower. Not every story inside Pelican Bay belonged to inmates. Some belonged to the staff. One correctional officer, young, barely a few years on the job, decided to speak out. He'd seen too much. Guards looking the other way during beatings, contraband sliding past checkpoints, brutality hidden from reports. He contacted a journalist in secret, passing along notes about what really happened behind the walls. The information was explosive. Details of gang control, corruption, and cover-ups. But word spread fast inside Pelican Bay. Inmates whispered. Guards muttered. And soon the officer found a threatening message scratched into his locker: "We know." The whistleblower's courage brought light into darkness, but it also painted a target on his back. And in Pelican Bay, targets never stayed safe for long. Death in the cell. It happened on a quiet morning. Guards were doing routine checks when they noticed something strange. One cell door slightly ajar. Inside, the inmate was lying still, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. A bedsheet had been twisted into a noose tied to the bars. At first glance it looked like suicide. But investigators weren't so sure. The sheet was tied too high, the knot too perfect. Other inmates claimed they heard nothing. No cries. No struggle. Just silence. Rumors spread: was it suicide, or a message? Some said the man had been marked for crossing a gang. Others believed guards had staged it to keep control. In Pelican Bay, truth was slippery. Death was constant. And fear was the only thing certain. But the darkness didn't just swallow inmates. Sometimes, it swallowed the ones who guarded them too. Guards under fire. Working in Pelican Bay was a war of nerves. Guards walked tiers where every eye glared like a weapon. One officer patrolling a corridor felt a sudden splash against his face, boiling water mixed with chemicals thrown through the bars. His skin blistered instantly. He collapsed screaming while inmates roared with laughter from their cells. Attacks on staff skyrocketed. Ambushes with shanks, boiling oil from smuggled commissary food, even sharpened broom handles hidden as spears. Every shift was a gamble. Some officers snapped under the pressure. One quit mid-shift, walking out and never coming back. Others hardened, carrying the stress home, their families living with the constant fear of retribution. The line between guard and prisoner blurred. Both were trapped inside the same walls, living in a world ruled by violence. And then came the most shocking event yet, a moment that shook the entire prison system. The execution in the yard. It was broad daylight. The yard was full, inmates pacing, exercising, whispering in groups. Guards watched from towers, rifles ready. Then, without warning, two men broke from the crowd. They sprinted toward another inmate, their movements sharp and deliberate. One pulled a long steel shank, the other tackled the target to the ground. The stabbing was fast, brutal, and relentless. The victim screamed once, then fell silent as steel plunged again and again. Blood soaked the dirt, pooling beneath his body. Guards opened fire, shots cracking across the yard. Inmates dropped flat, hands over their heads. The attackers finally released their victim, tossing the weapon aside before lying face down. But the damage was done. The execution had been carried out in full view of everyone, a chilling reminder that inside Pelican Bay, no one was untouchable. And it wasn't just violence inside anymore. The prison's shadow was stretching far beyond its walls. The reach beyond. Pelican Bay wasn't only a cage, it was a command center. From inside those cells, orders flowed outward, reaching streets across California and beyond. Phone calls smuggled through burners, coded messages passed through lawyers, and hidden notes carried instructions for drug deals, extortion, and even murders on the outside. One gang leader, locked in the SHU for over a decade, was still controlling an empire worth millions. Another ordered a killing hundreds of miles away with nothing more than a smuggled phone and a whispered code. The walls kept their bodies in, but not their power. Pelican Bay's influence spilled into cities, neighborhoods, even across borders. And as investigators uncovered just how far the reach extended, the truth became clear. Pelican Bay wasn't just a prison. It was the heart of a criminal network stretching across the nation. But inside, the pressure kept building. And what came next would test the limits of even Pelican Bay itself. The code of silence. Inside Pelican Bay, one rule reigned above all others: silence. Inmates didn't talk to guards. They didn't confess. They didn't point fingers. Even when covered in blood, they said nothing. This silence wasn't just fear, it was survival. Anyone labeled a snitch was marked for death. But silence spread beyond inmates. Guards, too, followed their own unwritten code. If a fellow officer crossed the line, using too much force, sneaking in contraband, it was often ignored. Reporting it meant isolation. One guard finally broke that code, speaking out about abuse he'd witnessed. Weeks later, he found his car vandalized, his tires slashed, and a note under the windshield: "Keep quiet." The code of silence made Pelican Bay a world apart, its own society, its own rules. And that society was about to crack under the weight of its own violence. The blackout. It happened without warning. One night, the entire prison plunged into darkness. The hum of lights, the buzz of cameras, the mechanical clang of steel doors, all gone. For a few minutes, Pelican Bay went silent. Then came the chaos. Inmates shouted, banged on doors, and hurled threats into the black. Guards scrambled with flashlights, radios crackling as they tried to hold control. Rumors spread fast. Some inmates believed it was an escape attempt, others whispered it was sabotage. No one knew for sure. In the dark, a guard was ambushed, dragged toward a cell, his flashlight clattering across the floor. Backup arrived just in time, dragging him to safety. Power was restored hours later, but the blackout left scars. For those inside, it was proof of how fragile control really was. One failure of the system and Pelican Bay was on the brink of total war. The secret tunnel. Months after the blackout, construction crews working near the outer wall made a shocking discovery: a partially dug tunnel. Hidden beneath a maintenance shed, the tunnel stretched dozens of feet, reinforced with makeshift supports. Investigators found tools fashioned from scraps of metal, clothing, even plastic trays. The plan had been simple but daring: dig slowly, cover the entrance, and wait for the right night to break through. The tunnel was incomplete when it was discovered, but it sent shockwaves through the prison. If inmates in one of the most secure facilities in America could tunnel out, what else were they capable of? Guards doubled searches. Yard times shrank. Security tightened. But with every crackdown, inmates grew more inventive. And soon, their creativity would take violence to a horrifying new level. The firestorm. It started in a single cell, a burning mattress shoved against the bars. But within minutes, flames spread as other inmates joined in, tossing rags, paper, and anything that would burn. Smoke poured through the block, alarms blaring. Guards rushed in with hoses, but the fire spread faster than expected. The heat warped metal, blackened ceilings, and filled the air with choking fumes. Amid the fire, chaos erupted. Some inmates attacked guards with makeshift weapons, while others used the smoke as cover to settle old scores, slashing rivals in the confusion. By the time the flames were contained, the block looked like a war zone: charred walls, flooded floors, and bodies dragged out on stretchers. The firestorm proved one chilling truth: Pelican Bay wasn't just dangerous. It was unstable, always one spark away from total collapse. The mass transfer. After the fire, California prison officials made a drastic decision. Dozens of the most dangerous inmates would be transferred out of Pelican Bay. It was an attempt to break the cycle of violence, to scatter gang leaders across the state. Shackled in chains, men were loaded onto buses under heavy guard, their eyes cold and silent as they stared through barred windows. But the transfer sparked new fears. Gangs that once had been concentrated inside Pelican Bay were now spread across multiple prisons, spreading their influence even further. For Pelican Bay, the transfers felt like a release valve, a chance to breathe. But everyone knew it was temporary. Because as long as the prison walls stood, as long as men were locked in concrete cages, the violence would always return. And deep inside the SHU, in those silent cells, new plans were already being whispered. The secret language. Communication was supposed to be impossible in Pelican Bay's SHU. Inmates were locked in solitary, unable to see or touch each other. But humans always find a way. Prisoners developed a secret language. Kites, tiny paper notes, passed under doors with strings. Tapping codes, messages knocked through concrete walls. Toilet talk, flushing water to carry voices from cell to cell. Through these systems, gangs coordinated attacks, smuggled orders, and even planned outside crimes. One guard intercepted a kite and discovered it was more than just prison chatter. It was a hit order, complete with names and dates. That discovery stopped one killing, but it also proved the inmates' reach was stronger than anyone thought. And when guards tried to crack down, the inmates responded with a new kind of protest, one that turned the entire prison upside down. The sound of chaos. It began with a single clang. An inmate banged his food tray against the bars, the noise echoing down the tier. Then another joined in. Soon the entire block thundered with the deafening rhythm of metal slamming against steel. The sound was overwhelming, an endless roar that rattled guards' nerves. Some described it like standing inside a drum. It went on for hours, a storm of noise that drowned out every order and command. But the sound was more than noise, it was unity. It was proof the inmates could still control the atmosphere, even from inside locked cages. When guards tried to break it up, they were met with spit, insults, and even feces hurled through slots. The sound didn't stop until exhaustion silenced it. Yet that storm of noise was only a warning. The real storm came when inmates decided silence wasn't enough, and blood would speak louder. The yard betrayal. Two inmates walked side by side in the yard, their heads bent close, as if whispering about escape or commissary deals. They had been seen together for weeks, eating at the same tables, lifting weights under the same corner of the yard. But in Pelican Bay, friendship was fragile. Without warning, one of the men pulled a sharpened shank from his waistband and drove it deep into the other's chest. The victim staggered back, shock written across his face. He tried to call for help, but the second strike silenced him. Blood spread across the dirt as guards stormed in, rifles raised. The betrayal stunned everyone. If a man could be killed by someone he trusted, then trust itself had no meaning. In Pelican Bay, loyalty lasted only as long as it was useful, and betrayal was always waiting. But betrayal wouldn't stay confined to inmates. It was about to infect the very staff meant to keep control. Inside job. Contraband had always been a problem at Pelican Bay, but now the investigation uncovered something darker. A staff member smuggling in weapons. An officer, buried in debt and desperate for money, had been slipping shanks, tobacco, and even cell phone parts through security in exchange for bribes. His deliveries fueled gang wars, strengthened black markets, and gave inmates more power than ever. When the officer was finally caught, the discovery rocked the prison. If staff couldn't be trusted, what chance did Pelican Bay have of control? The betrayal ignited fury among other guards, but also paranoia. How many more were compromised? How many worked for the inmates instead of against them? The line between law and crime blurred once again. And in the middle of that blur, violence waited to strike. The bloodbath in Block D. It happened fast. Too fast. Block D, already known for its tension, erupted during a routine movement. One inmate shoved another, insults flying. Within seconds, a dozen men were locked in brutal combat. Shanks pierced flesh, fists broke jaws, blood sprayed across the concrete. Guards rushed in, shields up, batons swinging, but the block was chaos. One guard was dragged into the melee, his helmet ripped off, fists pounding against his skull. Alarms wailed, tear gas filled the air, and the riot squad stormed the tier. Bodies were dragged out one by one, blood staining the floor red. By the end, several inmates were dead. Dozens were wounded. Guards were hospitalized. Block D was sealed. But the scars went deeper than blood. The riot proved Pelican Bay wasn't just unstable, it was spiraling. And the spiral was dragging everyone inside toward something darker than ever before. The stolen keys. It began with a mistake. During a chaotic shift change, a set of keys went missing. For staff, it was panic. Keys meant access, to cells, to gates, to control. For inmates, keys meant freedom, or chaos. Hours later, guards found the keys inside a mop bucket, but by then the damage was done. Rumors exploded. Inmates boasted about who had them, about how close they came to opening doors and flooding the tiers with violence. Even if no cells were opened, the message was clear: security wasn't airtight. And in Pelican Bay, even the smallest crack in control could turn deadly. That fear turned real when days later a guard was cornered in a dark corridor and discovered those missing keys had been copied. The corridor ambush. The guard was making his rounds in a dimly lit corridor when he heard the sound of metal. Before he could react, an inmate lunged, swinging a blade. Another came from behind, blocking the exit. The copied key had given them access to areas they were never supposed to reach. The ambush was precise, timed, and brutal. The guard fought back, baton striking wildly, but the attackers pressed harder. Just as the blade neared his throat, reinforcements arrived. Riot officers storming the corridor, shields smashing through the chaos. The guard survived, barely, blood soaking his uniform. The attackers were dragged away in chains. But the ambush proved something terrifying. The inmates weren't just violent, they were organized. And that organization was about to reach its deadliest form yet. The Prison Council. Inside the SHU, leaders from rival gangs created something new, a secret council. For decades, gangs had fought each other endlessly. But now, behind Pelican Bay's concrete, they found common ground. Instead of wasting strength on small fights, they agreed to coordinate, to share contraband routes, to control riots, to dictate hits with precision. The council was invisible, but its power was everywhere. Yard fights stopped overnight. Contraband flowed more smoothly. Even murders became more strategic, targeted at enemies instead of random violence. For the prison, it was a nightmare. Instead of weakening gangs, Pelican Bay had forced them into alliances. It wasn't chaos anymore, it was war with a chain of command. And soon, that council would unleash a plan so massive, it would shake the prison to its foundation. The Great Diversion. It started with a small fire in a trash bin. Guards rushed to contain it, barely noticing when shouts rose from the far tier. Then another fire broke out. Then another. The prison filled with smoke, alarms blaring. Inmates pounded their doors, screaming, flooding the block with noise and chaos. While guards scrambled to contain the fires, a group of inmates executed the real plan, a coordinated assault on rivals in another block. With shanks hidden for weeks, they launched the attack at the height of the diversion. By the time guards realized the fires were a decoy, blood already stained the floor. 2 inmates were dead, several more gravely wounded. The council had shown its strength: distraction, coordination, execution. Pelican Bay wasn't just violent anymore, it was tactical. And the next move would be even worse. The bloody morning. It was just after dawn. Guards opened cell doors for routine movement. Inmates shuffled out, heads down, chains clinking. Then, without warning, a dozen men erupted into violence. Hidden blades, sharpened pipes, and fists flew. They targeted one inmate in particular, rumored to have disrespected the council. The ambush was merciless. He was stabbed again and again, collapsing in a pool of blood as alarms screamed overhead. Guards tried to intervene, but every second brought more chaos. When it was finally over, the man's body was barely recognizable. The morning routine had turned into a massacre. And for Pelican Bay, it was the clearest message yet. The council was in control and they ruled in blood. The prisoners' war plan. The council had tasted power and now they wanted more. Hidden messages passed through kites and coded taps revealed their ultimate plan: to launch the largest coordinated uprising Pelican Bay had ever seen. It wouldn't just be one yard fight or one riot. It would be a chain reaction: fires, ambushes, block takeovers, all timed to overwhelm guards. For once, inmates from rival gangs agreed to fight on the same side. Prison intelligence caught fragments of the plan. Extra staff were called in, riot gear prepared, and helicopters put on standby. Everyone inside the walls felt the tension. It wasn't if violence would erupt, it was when. The storm was coming. And Pelican Bay braced for war. The day of chaos. It started with the sound of steel slamming. In Block C, dozens of inmates suddenly refused to return to their cells. They hurled food, flipped tables, and shouted war chants. Guards moved in with batons, only to be driven back by a hail of makeshift weapons. At the same moment, Block D erupted in fire. Mattresses burned, smoke choking the air as inmates pounded their doors. In the yard, rival gangs, normally at each other's throats, joined together, attacking officers with sharpened pipes. Every alarm in the prison screamed at once. Tear gas canisters exploded. Gun towers fired warning shots that cracked through the chaos. Helicopters hovered above, floodlights sweeping the yard. Pelican Bay had become a battlefield. The bloody aftermath. Hours later, the uprising was finally crushed. Dozens of inmates were dragged out, faces bloodied, eyes burning with rage. Some lay still on the ground, unmoving. The prison floors were slick with blood and water from fire hoses. The chow hall was wrecked, windows shattered, walls scorched. Guards limped away with broken bones, cuts, and burns. Ambulances screamed through the gates, carrying both inmates and staff. The numbers were staggering. Multiple dead, scores injured, and the prison scarred deeper than ever before. But beneath the chaos, one fact became clear: the uprising hadn't failed. It had proved that even inside the most secure supermax, inmates still held terrifying power. The lockdown of legends. In response, officials ordered what became known as the lockdown of legends. 4 months, every inmate was confined 24/7. No yard. No visits. No programs. Food through a slot, 1 shower a week, and endless silence. Guards worked double shifts. Riot gear became standard. The prison felt less like a correctional facility and more like a war fortress. Some inmates broke under the strain, losing their grip on reality. Others dug deeper into gang loyalty, vowing revenge when the lockdown finally ended. The walls held for now. But everyone inside knew the truth: Pelican Bay wasn't safer. It was only waiting. Waiting for the next spark. The legacy of fear. Years later, Pelican Bay's name still carries a weight of terror. Former inmates describe it as a place where hope dies and fear never sleeps. Guards who worked there talk of nightmares, scars, and memories that never fade. The hunger strikes, the riots, the blood oaths, the endless lockdowns, each one left its mark. Each one exposed a truth the world outside rarely sees. Pelican Bay wasn't just built to cage men. It became a symbol of violence, of survival, of a justice system stretched beyond its limits. And even now, behind its concrete walls and razor wire fences, the cycle continues. Blood spilled. Silence kept. Power shifting from shadows. Because Pelican Bay isn't just a prison. It's a story that never truly ends. Pelican Bay exposed. This is the truth of Pelican Bay Supermax. A place designed to control the uncontrollable, but instead became one of the darkest battlefields in America's prison history. Every riot, every hunger strike, every life lost behind those walls leaves us with one question. Backhand index pointing right: can a prison built on fear ever truly bring peace? And as long as Pelican Bay stands, the world will keep asking, what really happens behind these walls?